Okay, hello. Thank you everyone for coming to our first online only Disability Futurity seminar. In a way, really increasing the accessibility of it. So there is tiny upsides to COVID. I'm Ryan Patterson, project director of the series here at the Carleton University Disability Research Group. And then we've got David Bolt as the director at Liverpool Hope University. Today, we're lucky to have Dr. Ryan Sweet, lecturer in humanities and foundation year director at Swansea University in the UK. Dr. Sweet studies the ways that prosthetic body parts were represented in 19th and 20th century literature and culture. And now this includes human prostheses, also the fascinating history of disability and prosthetics in animals, and where those concepts intersected. Before Swansea, he taught at the universities of Exeter, Bath Spa, Leeds, and Plymouth. He has a forthcoming book, as well as several articles and book chapters on literary and cultural disability studies. And as we work to reconceptualize this seminar series in light of COVID-19 disruption, Ryan kindly and flexibly offered to prepare this talk with very little warning. Thank you again for that. So recognizing you're muted visually, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan Sweet.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope everyone is safe and well and that you can hear me okay. Thank you very much for taking some time out of your day, wherever you are, to join me. I'm just going to get my slides up there now. Hopefully you can see them. Thank you very much to Ryan and the Carleton Disability Research Group for inviting me to be with you today. I'm looking forward to this. I'm excited to be here. I do have a few caveats to put out there before I start my talk. The first thing is that I'm going to be reading my paper today. I realize that this isn't the most accessible way to deliver a paper. And so as a contingency, I've shared with you links to both the slides that I'll be using, as well as the script. So hopefully you can find those in the chat. You should have access to them. So please feel free to follow along if you prefer, or to review them in your own time, if I move a little bit too quickly. Of all the days for it to happen, of course, today is the day where I'm experiencing home Wi-Fi issues. In practicing the talk earlier today, it did cut out on me a couple of times. I've reset my router, so I'm hoping that it won't happen during the talk. But if it does, please do just hold tight and I'll try to reconnect as quickly as I can. There will be a published version of the paper that I'm delivering today that will be coming out hopefully later this year in Andrew Mangham's Cambridge University Press edited collection, Literature and Medicine in the 19th Century. So if you're interested, there's that you can follow up with if you like. The final thing I'll say is that the topic of disability futurity does come up in this talk, but it will come up quite late on. So again, please hang tight. I will get there at some point. Okay, so the title of my paper is Wholeness, in scare quotes, Incompleteness, and Disabled Futurity in Victorian Prosthesis Narratives. And I'd like to begin with a quotation from Ernest G. Henham's 1897 short story, A Human Bundle. I think you had better not go to look at him. He's a dreadful object, the worst I've seen. They cut off his legs close to the trunk, his arms at the shoulders, the nose and the ears. He was such a handsome fellow too, but I tell you, sir, now he's nothing better than a human bundle, a lump of breathing, useless flesh. End of quote. Published in the metropolitan middle-class family magazine Temple Bar in 1897, Canadian-British author Ernest G. Henham's short story, A Human Bundle, is a text that in hyperbolic terms perpetuates fears about physical loss, anxiety central to 19th century Western bodily discourse. The quotation from a horrified medical student who has witnessed the shocking amputation of an unfortunate young man's legs, arms, nose, and ears suggests what the loss of body parts meant in the 19th century. For the medical student, the patient is neither human nor useful, but rather nothing better than a human bundle. The student's harsh and ableist assessment is partially justified by the egregious nature of the medical procedures undertaken, but such a response raises a series of questions about what constituted physical normalcy and difference in this period, what historical factors underpinned negative attitudes to non-normative bodies, and to what extent the apparent hegemony of physical wholeness was complicated by literary representations. This talk will explore, on the one hand, how, as the concept of physical normalcy became increasingly reinforced as culturally dominant, those who were perceived to be missing body parts were marginalized. Buttressed by a post-Enlightenment belief that medicine and the emerging sciences could fix the issue of bodily loss, what disability studies scholars call the medical model of disability, prostheses came to the fore as devices that could supposedly standardize aberrant bodies, making them aesthetically acceptable and useful. However, because prostheses were and remain devices that undermine binaries of self, other, organic, artificial, real, fake, and disabled, non-disabled, they also complicated the hegemony of organic wholeness. Their very production was mandated by preferences for physical completeness, but their implementation shifted definitions of what it meant to be whole. The conceptual complexity of the prosthetic provided material to fiction writers who responded to the growing dominance of physical wholeness. Using two fictional case studies that represent artificial hand users, English poet, novelist, and playwright Robert Williams Buchanan's Lady Letitia's Lilliput Hand, published in 1862, and the lesser-known short story writer T. Lockhart's Prince Rupert's Emerald Ring, published in 1895, I argue that literary representations of prostheses often simultaneously reinforced and complicated the hegemony of physical completeness. Such stories perpetuated fears of physical disaggregation while also bringing into question the efficacy of prostheticizing. Though for reasons of concision, I primarily investigate upper limb loss in relation to ableist discourses, it should be noted that related social attitudes also permeated and at times were problematized in literary representations of other prosthesis users, including consumers of artificial legs, eyes, teeth, and hair. To demonstrate how and why physical wholeness became culturally dominant in the 19th century and how literary representations of prosthetics coextensively endorsed and critiqued this model, this talk is split into two. The first part surveys the historical factors underpinning the rise of physical normalcy. The second part then turns to the transgressive representations of prostheses. Here I explore the motif of the uncanny artificial hand. On a practical level, the perceived need for prostheses in the 19th century can be partially attributed to not only an increased risk to bodily integrity affected by industrialism, but also developments in surgical practice, hygiene, and pain relief. Innovations such as the implementation of soft tissue and transfixion flap modifications to amputation techniques, the introduction of anesthetics in the 1840s, and the gradual adoption of Listerian principles of prophylactic antisepsis from the 1870s onwards, meant that more patients survived amputations and more survived with serviceable stumps suitable for being fitted with prosthetics. These developments coincided with, and to an extent responded to, a rise in injuries to limbs stemming from the growing use of industrial machinery in the workplace, which was often poorly regulated, and the increasing efficacy of firearms used on the battlefield. Part of the story of why prostheses became increasingly desirable commodities can thus be explained by the enlarged number of amputees affected by modernity in 19th century Britain. But such a narrative only paints part of the picture. Also circulating in this period were an increasingly codified set of conventions that positioned physical normalcy as positive and difference as negative. To use David Bolt's terminology from his tripartite model of disability, we see the rise of normative positivism, the privileging of normalcy, that is ableism, and non-normative negativism, the denigration of physical difference, that is disableism. A range of social, medical, and legal factors enmeshed, placing considerable pressure on amputees to use prostheses to not only help perform certain bodily acts, but also to attempt to pass as normal so as to avoid discrimination and social marginalization. Though there has been considerable debate as to when a concept of physical normalcy emerged, what disability studies scholars tend to agree on is that the dominance of the normal body is historically contingent, socially constructed, and in societies where it is present, a pervasive marginalizing force that works to the detriment of peoples whose bodies are perceived as non-normative. Aligning with the work of Leonard J. Davis, Rosemary Garland Thompson, and Lillian Creighton, this talk sees the 19th century as a seminal period in terms of the Western development of normalcy as hegemonic. Among the most important and well-covered factors contributing to the rise of normalcy in the 19th century was the development of bodily statistics. Belgian mathematician, statistician, astronomer, and sociologist Lambert Adolphe Quetelet's concept of l'homme moyen, or the average man, became popular in England in the 1830s. As Creighton explains, Quetelet's A Treatise on Man and the Development of His Faculties, published in 1835, quote, calculated the mathematical norms for a range of physical and social categories, everything from head circumference to age of marriage to criminal tendency, in order to draw a detailed portrait of the human norm, end of quote. For Quetelet, his average man constituted a kind of paradoxical ideal. In his words, if the average man were completely determined, we might consider him as the type of perfection, and everything differing from his proportions or condition would constitute deformity and disease. Everything found dissimilar, not only as regarded proportion and form, but as exceeding the observed limits would constitute a monstrosity, end of quote. Quetelet's influential claims, which aligned normalcy with health and difference with illness, evidence Bruce Haley's observation that Victorian understandings of health centered on the concept of wholeness. The implications of Quetelet's work on non-normative bodies are concisely noted by Davis. When we think of bodies in a society when the concept of the norm is operative, then people with disabilities will be thought of as deviants, end of quote. Another significant context that contributed to the stigmatization of physical loss was the developing, though markedly controversial, scientific and philosophic interest in breaking down Cartesian boundaries between mind and body. This movement intersected with Quetelet's taxonomical work and built upon the principles germane to physiognomy and phrenology, popular sciences of assessing character by facial appearance and cranium shape, respectively. The impact of such work further solidified the premium on physical completeness. For instance, preeminent psychiatrist Henry Maudsley, a key figure in the drive to develop a physiological approach towards the phenomena of the mind, labeled by some as the psychophysiology movement, bolstered links between mind and body in his 1874 work, Responsibility in Mental Disease. For Maudsley, the brain was not the only physiological matter that could influence the mind. For him, other parts of the body could affect the temperament of the subject in various ways. Associating physical deviances with specific moods and behaviors, Maudsley implied that those who displayed physical difference were also mentally aberrant, therefore legitimizing the work of Quetelet. Endorsing a theory that suggested physical and mental degeneration are passed on to several generations, Maudsley and his affiliates supported a deterministic understanding of the human condition that stigmatized physical difference. This growing scientific interest in forging links between mind and body, compounded with Quetelet's popularization of social statistics, culminating in the publication of Cesar Lombroso's Criminal Man in 1876, a work that famously attempted to demonstrate empirically a correlation between monstrousness and criminality. Curiously, though, Lombroso's text was never translated fully into English. Its impact, though Lombroso's text was never translated fully into English, its impact in Britain was profound nonetheless. The deviant body thus became an increasingly centralized topic as anxieties about physical aberrancy and degeneration grew. Such a process of marginalization reinforced the dominance of physical wholeness. In addition to the feared criminal traits of those who displayed physical difference, the premium on physical integrity was also bolstered by medical and lingering folkloric views of the aberrant body as a direct physical threat to normative society. For instance, anxieties surrounding maternal impression, the theory that if a pregnant woman witnessed a person with a deformity, the shock caused by such an encounter could result in her unborn child bearing a similar affliction, to use contemporary terminology, thrived in Victorian Britain. Linked to such fears, Martha Stoddard Holmes explains that for many Victorians, quote, any physical impairment had the potential to be perceived as transmissible by contact, by Myers-Becker, by a combination of contact, environment, and individual constitution, or perhaps simply by the social class into which one was born, end of quote. The sheer variety of explanations listed by Holmes reveals the heightened level of anxiety that surrounded disability in terms of heritable and contagious risk. In addition to the various scientific and medical developments that buttress normative positivism and non-normative negativism, several important legal and social changes also contributed. Linked to Quetelet's drive for standardization, another event of the 1830s that further stimulated anxieties surrounding physical difference was the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. The new system sent able-bodied men seeking relief to the workhouse while providing limited out relief to those deemed deserving. That is, those who were perceived unable to work, including the young, the elderly, and the disabled. Much discussion about the extent to which unwaged disabled people were deserving of relief perpetuated as a result. The Act thus brought public attention to the ability of aberrant bodies, the classifying of such bodies, and an association of physical difference with mendicancy. Related to this legal and social discourse, changing meanings of work further exacerbated links between physical difference and a perceived lack of productivity, a factor that had particular implications for men, the primary breadwinners in this period. Texts such as Thomas Carlyle's Past and Present and Samuel Smiles's Self-Help, published in 1843 and 1859 respectively, were influential as they propounded the importance of industriousness and renounced idleness. John Tosh plots the rise of this ideology between the Reform Acts of 1832 and 1884, when suspicion surrounding privilege gained momentum and the faith in the idea of individual autonomy took its place. Such ableist emphases on autonomy and industry meant that those exhibiting physical difference were seen as lacking the necessary attributes to succeed in life. As O'Connor explains, Victorian ideals of health, particularly of male health, centered on the concept of physical wholeness. A strong, vigorous body was the primary signifier of manliness, at once testifying to the existence of a correspondingly strong spirit, and providing that spirit with a vital means of material expression, end of quote. As we learn from Henham's The Human Bundle, where the maimed man is branded, quote, a lump of breathing useless flesh, for men in particular, physical difference, especially when obvious and extreme, was seen as an indicator of a subject's lack of productive potential. While men who were seen as physically incomplete were often believed to be unable to work, a point evidenced in autobiographical memoirs of disabled factory workers such as William Dodd, women missing body parts were regularly represented as unmarriageable and thus not useful in terms of procreation or social obligations. They were thus viewed as part of the so-called superfluous women problem. Exceptions to this trend were imagined in literary texts, such as Wilkie Collins's Poor Miss Finch, published in 1872. But in reality, barriers existed that made it difficult for physically and cognitively different women to enter the marriage market. For instance, the same contemporary medical science that warned of the transmissibility of disability placed disproportionate stress on women, raising proto-eugenicist concerns about non-normative mothers extending their supposedly contaminated bloodlines. Before turning to the fictional representations of prostheses, which I argue complicated the growing dominance of physical wholeness, it is worth considering the position that the emerging prosthesis market assumed amidst the culture described so far. Aligning with the trends in patent medicine described by historians such as James Harvey Young, Anne Digby, and Claire L. Jones, prosthetists of all types, including makers of limbs, eyes, teeth, and hair, capitalized on and contributed to the perpetuation of growing anxieties about maintaining or attaining physical integrity. As O'Connor has shown us, the notion of rebuilding amputees to a condition of wholeness was commonly evoked in 19th century prosthesis discourse, especially in terms of male amputees. American prosthesis firm A.A. Marks, one of the most famous and internationally successful makers of its time, for instance, included the following testimony from the Atlanta Christian Index and Southwestern Baptist in its 1888 catalogue. Quote, "Mr. Marks has the most skilled mechanics in his manufactory, turning out frequently a dozen or more limbs a week. It is interesting to see his patrons leave their crutches in his office and walk off apparently whole. Men too who had lost both legs and who were brought in by attendants." End of quote. After purchasing one of Marks's patented artificial legs with rubber foot, John Mackenzie, a Civil War amputee, similarly testified, quote, "I felt like a whole man again," end of quote. Limb makers such as Marks were keen to assert to potential users the abilities of their devices to recomplete disaggregated bodies. The popular consensus among historians of prostheses is that the artificial legs produced by high-end makers such as A.A. Marks, though prohibitively expensive and thus only available to a limited group in Britain, were in many cases effective functionally for lower limb amputees. Top-of-the-range artificial legs were, it seems, helpful in terms of enabling physical locomotion and, if disguised correctly by clothing, assisting a user to pass as normal. Artificial arms, by contrast, were not so effective. Sue Zemke explains that due to difficulties replicating the complex biomechanics of the human hand, artificial arms, quote, "languished on an impasse between functional and natural appearance," end of quote. Rudimentary hooks, available many years before the Victorian period, remained the most effective artificial hands up until and far beyond the turn of the 20th century. Though, as Zemke states, one must be careful regarding the application of labels of progress and improvement to the 19th century history of artificial arms, there certainly was enumeration in terms of new designs, manufacturers, and marketing. Improvements in artificial arms were ultimately insubstantial, but the transatlantic attention paid to developing technologies to replace lost arms was unprecedented. In the 1820s, there were 3 artificial limb firms in London. By the 1880s, there were 18. Furthermore, though we can certainly question the functionality of 19th century artificial hands and arms, contemporary manufacturers were not shy in promoting their devices as great successes. Carefully constructed testimonials hinted at the somewhat ornamental nature of their artificial arms, without making their limited functionality manifest. For instance, a commendation by Eli J. Wing for American maker John S. Drake's artificial arm read, quote, "It improves my form so that a stranger would not notice that I'd ever lost my shoulder, and it more than meets my expectation as to keeping my coat in place," end of quote. Here we can see how prosthesis advertisements sought to balance honesty with endorsement, while perpetuating the apparent need for amputees to use prostheses in order to pass. The relationship between literature and the contemporary prosthesis market was a complex one. On the one hand, literary texts often endorsed the physical preferences for physical wholeness that made the production of artificial body parts such a growing industry in the 19th century. For instance, in Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend, a text by an author for whom prostheses permeate his very conception of narrative and his sense of the organic structure of the novel. The amputee Silas Wegg is depicted as physically inferior to the able-bodied characters that he competes with in his battle for social mobility. Other depictions, on the other hand, tended to mock attempts at replicating the natural form of the human body. For instance, Anthony Trollope's representation of Miss Ruff's aptly stern-looking artificial eye in The Bertrams, published in 1859, thereby problematizing the social investment in occluding physical difference from public view. A trope of prosthesis representation which this talk explores used the uncanny verisimilitude of the high-end prosthesis as a narrative device to invite reader intrigue. While this talk could explore better remembered texts that use this representational model, for example, Edgar Allan Poe's The Man That Was Used Up, published in 1839, or The Spectacles, published in 1844, in what follows, I bring two neglected texts, which both focus on artificial arms, to the fore, namely Buchanan's Lady Letitia's Lilliput Hand and Lockhart's Prince Rupert's Emerald Ring. These texts, I argue, not only use prostheses as plot devices, but can also be read as having exposed the fragility of physical wholeness's dominance. The use of highly finished prostheses in these texts reveals the complex and contradictory attitudes that encompass responses to the use of such devices. If we consider prosthesis consumption as at least in part fueled by medical model understanding of physical difference, an approach that sees the disabled body as defective and in need of curing, the following analyses provide examples of Paul K. Longmore and Laurie Umansky's claim that, quote, the medical model, powerful though it has been in shaping the life experiences of people with disabilities, has never gone uncontested. Reflecting their limited real-life success and uptake, unlike prosthetic lower limbs, in particular peg legs, which were depicted frequently in literary stories, think, for example, of Captain Ahab, Arthur Conan Doyle's villain, Jonathan Small, and a host of Dickensian figures, including not only Silas Wegg, but also Simon Tappertit and Mr. Tongueye. Prosthetic hands and arms appeared less often in 19th century literature, while hook hand users, including most famously Captain Cuttle and Captain Hook, were occasionally represented in 19th and early 20th century literature and culture. Artificial hands, by which I mean more sophisticated prostheses that attempted to stand in aesthetically and functionally for absent limbs, were few and far between in literary texts from this period. The few texts that included artificial hand using characters such as Buchanan's Lady Letitia's Lilliput Hand and Lockhart's Prince Rupert's Emerald Ring brought to the fore the haptic differences between the organic and the artificial hand. As I will suggest, by focusing on the inability of artificial hands to replicate how organic hands feel to others, as well as how they enable sensory touch, these stories brought into focus the inadequacies of a medical model approach to hand loss, which sought to render invisible amputated stumps. On the one hand, then, these stories were buttressed by an ableism that saw the whole organic body as sacrosanct, but on the other, they also suggest how ableist impulses might lead to absurd results in terms of the use of prostheses for passing. Buchanan's Lady Letitia's Lilliput Hand was written in the style of sensation fiction. and published when that literary mode was at its height in 1862. It therefore appeared almost a decade before the author's career-defining public spat with Algernon Charles Swinburne and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, in which he famously labelled the latter of the fleshly school of poetry, a charge that seems somewhat rich after learning more about Buchanan's earlier short story. Lady Letitia's Lilliput Hand explores the history of an alluring yet highly mysterious woman whose most attractive features are her conspicuously dainty, perfectly formed hands. As the author remarks, quote, "It was by her beautiful hands that the Lady Letitia achieved her choicest triumphs. Hands so tinily, delicately lovely were never imitated by sculptor. And when she waved them before her slaves, the heart was hushed with admiration," end of quote. Helena Mickey has identified how common it was for women's hands to function as sexual symbols in the Victorian novel. As Claire Stainthorpe puts it, 19th century norms of female dress push the localization of the erotic to the peripheries of the body, the hand being one such site. But in the case of Lady Letitia, the narrator's normative positivism is complicated as we learn more about one of her hands in particular. We first meet Lady Letitia amidst a scramble of suitors attempting to take her hand in marriage. The frontrunner for her affections, the wealthy artist Edward Van Sittart, is kept at arm's length by the protagonist after a second mysterious character, Mr. Montague Vernon, appears on the scene. As we move forward, we learn that this new arrival is in fact a disguised figure from Lady Letitia's past. Vernon is in fact Lewis Carr, the once fraudulent associate of her late husband, the financially ruined gambling addict, Lord Augustus Marlowe. The narrator reveals that Vernon/Carr had previously attempted to win Letitia's affections by manipulative and duplicitous means and intends to do so again by blackmailing her with misleading evidence that portrays her as her husband's murderer. The visual motif that Buchanan centres the unravelling mystery on is Lady Letitia's wonderfully formed left hand, which we learn is prosthetic. The narrator reveals that her hand was amputated after it was crushed by a heavy window during a deathbed struggle with her late husband, who it turns out had poisoned himself to frame Lady Letitia as his murderer, a desperate attempt at revenge after discovering that Carr's attempts to woo his wife had made some progress. All ends well, however. Lady Letitia manages to counter Vernon/Carr's blackmail by threatening to claim him as an accomplice and reveal his identity to the authorities, a move that would be disastrous for the blackmailer since he's wanted for gambling fraud. Carr flees but is unluckily arrested and later hanged for his crimes, while Lady Letitia and Van Sittart are happily reunited. Running counter to contemporary marital norms, Van Sittart marries Lady Letitia even after she reveals all, including the fact that her most prized asset, her hand, is artificial. As a kind of postscript for the narrative, the narrator includes a note from Van Sittart commenting on his marriage with Lady Letitia. We learn that she was a good wife and that she died after giving birth to his eldest daughter. Highlighting the narrative and symbolic work that the prosthetic body part does in this story, it ends with a gothic yet sentimentalized image. Van Sittart reveals that he keeps the Lilliput hand as a memento. One of the ways that this short story exploits prosthesis use for narrative purpose, while also interrogating the use of such devices as solutions for physical loss, is through the way that it draws attention to the sensory difference of Lady Letitia's prosthesis. The bodily variation that her hand presents is indeed a source of mystery, intrigue, and grotesqueness. Her hand is cold to touch, providing a grotesque morbidity as well as a sense of foreboding and uncanniness to her literary depiction. The coldness of her hand provides a hint of her non-normativity, echoing the concern of the British prosthesis maker Henry Heather Bigg, who in 1855 lamented the fact that, quote, Touch instantly decides between the real hand and its counterfeit." End of quote. Adding to the grotesqueness of Buchanan's depiction, there is a shocking scene in which her hand is stabbed right the way through without causing so much as a drop of blood or a cry of pain. Her hand is thus depicted as conspicuously different to an organic one in that it both feels non-normative and is unable to feel itself. As Pamela K. Gilbert and Stainthorpe would point out, the fact that her hand is prosthetic exacerbates the tension between her passive, touched, aristocratic feminine hand and the active, touching, middle-class, masculine hands of her suitors. In aesthetic terms, her hand acts as a kind of Gothic motif, a kind of uncanny vestige of the past that works as a sensational plot device. We could also label the stabbing scene as an instance of bodily shock, a trademark of the sensation fiction genre. In fact, the centrality of Lady Letitia's prosthetic hand to the nexus of the plot provides evidence for Holmes and Mark Mossman's claim that disability can be seen as central to the very poetics of sensation fiction. However, chiming with Mossman's and Holmes's elaboration that disability is in no way a stable signifier in sensation fiction, there is clearly embedded in Buchanan's narrative a comment on the pressures of normativity. Though clearly underpinned by a way of thinking about the body that privileges organic physical completeness, the haptic critique of the prosthetic that this story brings to the fore questions the efficacy and potential implications of using a hand that looks real but feels fake. Lady Letitia's Lilliput hand suggests that using a device will always eventually invite suspicion, a feeling that no prosthesis user from this period wished to evoke, since doing so would undermine her or his ability to pass. The greatest resistance to normative positivism and non-normative negativism that Buchanan's short story provides comes in the form of the non-normative marital success that Lady Letitia eventually achieves. Ultimately, she is able to recapture Van Sittart's affection and secure his hand in marriage, not by concealing her use of a prosthesis, but by revealing its artificiality and the scandalous backstory that its use conceals. Alison Kafer's concept of crypt time provides a helpful model for understanding Buchanan's representation as not merely conforming to, but rather disrupting ableist traditions. Kafer's 2013 book, Feminist Queer Crip, conceptualizes crypt time in opposition to common curative trends in imagining disabled futurity, which see disability as something that should be avoided or cured at all costs. According to ableist thinking, the only conceivable alternative to being cured is a life of unending tragedy. Kafer instead seeks to imagine, quote, more accessible futures, a yearning for an elsewhere and perhaps an elsewhen in which disability is understood otherwise, as political, as valuable, as integral, end of quote. In other words, Kafer's project is to challenge the ableist thinking in our present that affects the real and imagined futures of people living with disabilities. It would be remiss to say that Lady Letitia's Lilliput hand participates in this kind of disruptive and progressive crypt project. But what can be argued is that the disabled future that it imagines for the amputee Lady Letitia is one that resists the hegemonic normative ways of thinking about disabled women in terms of marital futures. Lady Letitia can thus be read in relation to the transgressive, bold, and sexually active disabled female characters of Wilkie Collins's sensation fiction, Madonna Blythe of Hide and Seek, and Lucilla Finch of Poor Miss Finch, most notably. Unlike these novels, or indeed the familiar disabled marriage narratives described by Talia Schaefer, which presented disabled characters as integral parts of domestic marital family networks, Buchanan's text provides a direct affront to the normative positivism engendered by the curative concept of the concealing prosthesis, highlighting the success and attraction of disavowing passing as the primary prerogative for a prosthesis user. Van Sittart's decision to keep hold of the Lilliput hand after his wife's death is at once fetishistic and also revealing of a transgressive fondness for physical difference. The insensitivity of an artificial hand is, however, also a focal point of Lockhart's similarly sensational, though decidedly less serious, Prince Rupert's Emerald Ring. Very much a story with a secret, but not as socially transgressive as many sensation fiction texts. The plot of Lockhart's short story centres on a valuable ring that goes missing following a wedding reception. After following several false leads, we learn that the ring in question was all along worn on a broken wooden hand of the jewel's inheritor, a wealthy war veteran called General Wilkins. Ironically and unusually for a fictional representation of such a device, early on in the story, the functionality of Wilkins's prosthetic is lauded. Slipping the emerald ring on his false hand, the general boasts, "I can fish, shoot, hunt, carve, box, do anything with it, in fact." The asyndetic nature of this list highlights the innumerable ways in which his prosthesis is practicable. The artificial hand is even shown to possess some advantages over his organic one. First, his artificial fingers are slenderer than those of his original hand, which are too gouty for the ring to fit. Second, when he slips over after drinking too much wine, his wooden hand takes the brunt of the force, meaning that he remains unharmed. Only after the mystery is revealed and the unfeeling nature of the false hand is brought to the fore are the inadequacies of prostheses shown. The timing of this story at the end of the 19th century is particularly interesting, since at this time prostheses were often heralded as lifelike. A testimonial in A. A. Marx's 1888 treatise on prosthetics, for example, stated, "The arm I ordered of you last April gives perfect satisfaction. The rubber hand is immense. I do not think there could be anything gotten up to equal it. It looks perfectly natural. In fact, some of my friends did not know I had lost an arm." End of quote. The example shown on the slide, by which I mean the image, is in fact not one of Marx's rubber hands, but we can see that this contemporaneous device made by Somerset-based maker James Gillingham was also carefully carved to replicate the form of an organic hand and was designed to be worn with a glove over it to conceal its artificiality. Because of the supposed mimetic capacities of contemporary artificial limbs, we might consider Lockhart's story a critique of prostheses. The suggestion in this story is that each part that constitutes our body should be a feeling entity. For the author, the hand serves as a case study to make the point that while prostheses may look and even function like real body parts, they remain an accessory rather than a truly integrated aspect of the structural whole, since they cannot harmonize with the body's nervous system. The ableist premium on physical wholeness is thus again brought to the fore, while the logic of prostheticization is ironically challenged. Here, however, it is not necessarily the prosthesis that is faulty, but rather people's expectations of them. Clearly, Wilkins's hand is an effective functional aid for many physical activities, but it falls short when used in a manner in which it is intended to pass as a normal hand suitable for ring wearing. Analysing Lady Letitia's Lilliput hand and Prince Rupert's emerald ring complicates our understanding of Victorian attitudes to prostheses, showing that though ableist sentiments were often present, some texts did not fully accord to the status quo. Indeed, texts such as Buchanan's and Lockhart's challenged aspects central to the social dominance of physical wholeness. Buchanan's short story used the burgeoning socially disruptive sensation genre to present an ironically non-normative two-way marital solution for the issue of physical loss, honesty and acceptance of physical difference. Lockhart, on the other hand, presents an otherwise useful prosthesis whose insensate limitations make us question whether the potential to pass should really be a priority for prosthetic body parts. Though written for slightly different kinds of readers, Lady Letitia's Lilliput Hand for Temple Bar's metropolitan middle-class family readership, and Prince Rupert's Emerald Ring for Chambers's popular readership with emergent middle-class sentimentalities, both texts bring into question the dominance of physical wholeness by scrutinizing the mandate to pass as normal. Reading texts like these help us to appreciate how physical wholeness was being anatomized as it was being constructed. Thank you.
Okay, you can hear me, Ryan?
Yes, I can indeed. Yeah.
Okay. Thus everyone else can. I'm just asking you as the. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ryan, for that fascinating and really in-depth analysis. We're going to open up for discussion and questions now. To be honest, we can go for an hour. If it goes an hour, we'll see if people drop off for that. We've certainly got time. Now, everyone is currently muted. On the bottom left, assuming your view is all the same as mine, which is an impossible thing to know philosophically as well as in programs, there should be a mute button. We only have 20 people, so we should be able to do this without using the chat function. I'm going to go quiet for a minute, and if anyone has a question, please unmute your feed and just ask it. If we have multiple people speaking up, we'll sort it out. So are there any questions?
Yes, I have a question. Good morning, Ryan. Thank you very much for giving that presentation. I apologize. I came in a few minutes late. So your research, mainly, you're looking at the mid to late 19th century of disability studies, or what is your main focus?
So the majority of my research to date has been about the way that prosthetic body parts are represented in 19th and early 20th century literature and culture in North America and Britain. Mm-hmm. More recently, my interests have extended to relationships between humans, animals, and disability. So I've also started looking at some early representations of prosthetic body parts for animals, which emerge really, I think, from the late 18th century onwards in agriculture, and then come into pet culture in the later 19th century. And I'm also interested in imaginaries of relationships between disabled humans and animals as well. So Charles Dickens's Barnaby Rudge and the relationship depicted in that story between Grip the raven and the eponymous protagonist is particularly interesting for me. So that's a kind of a little overview of what I work on. Thanks, James.
I have a question. This is Leonard Davis. By the way, hi, David Bolt. I see you over there. And Ryan, thanks very much for your talk. It was very interesting. If I get the sort of general argument or thrust of the talk, it's that you might think that with the emphasis on wholeness and normalcy, that there would be kind of unanimity about the negative value of prostheses like this. And you're saying that in the cases that you're looking at, it's complicating it. I wondered if you had any thoughts about why these works take that particular view against maybe a larger or a stronger current of seeing prosthesis as a problem. In other words, have you come to any conclusions about the rationale for, let's say, those countervalent views of seeing prosthesis as something positive in this era?
I guess, yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you very much, Leonard. I guess my overarching argument really is that what these narratives reveal really is just how unstable as a concept physical wholeness is, and particularly how unstable it is when we bring prostheses into the equation, because of the way that prostheses, particularly when they're imagined, cut across these kind of fixed binaries of what it means to be disabled or non-disabled or organic or artificial. So there's something, I guess, kind of bigger conceptually going on there about just how, I guess, untenable this concept of physical wholeness is. But also, I guess, on the kind of more pragmatic side of things, I think some of the apparent impracticalities of the kind of devices that are being marketed in the 19th century and sold as as enabling users to pass and enabling amputees to have this kind of wonderful range of practical abilities is also something that seems to come under critique from these stories. So I think it's a kind of a mix of the two things. I've not really managed to sort of trace individual authors to particular kind of relationships with real life interactions with prostheses in too many cases. So I think it's more something to do with this kind of bigger issue of the conceptual fragility of concepts of normalcy and wholeness.
I mean, I assume that any concepts really are unstable when you start looking at them. I was just wondering, maybe, you know, like if we're thinking about COVID right now and the wearing of masks, which are kind of prosthesis in a way, you know, they're prosthetic. I think most Westerners used to have a kind of condescending view of people in Asia who you'd see wearing masks either in your public or in their public, thinking like, why are they being so careful? You know, and suddenly now we're all wearing masks, and the masks change in terms of their significance. And as you pointed out, the military efforts in the period in the 19th century were enormous, and the consequences to ordinary working people who were soldiers who were injured, clearly that would begin to change. I mean, I'm wondering whether that would change one's attitude toward a prosthesis, especially if it was a military one. I guess in one of your stories it is, as opposed to. And another question which is sort of floating around is whether factory workers who are probably injured more than soldiers, just in sheer numbers, that whether their injuries were considered in the same way. I mean, in other words, the red badge of courage versus the kind of factory labor that tends to be denigrated, and working class people tend to be not as valorized in that way, even though soldiers were working class as well. I just wondered, does that play into it at all?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And my research in the topic, I guess, failed to uncover too many representations of prosthesis using factory workers. They were fairly scant, actually, in the body of materials that I found, which I guess actually says quite a lot about exactly what you're saying there, kind of the social regard with which those users were treated. But it also tells us, I think, about the economic realities of the 19th century prosthesis industry, that these devices, the kinds that I describe in this talk, the kinds that are depicted in Lady Letitia's Lilliput Hand and the Emerald Ring, were prohibitively expensive and really only available to an elite minority, especially in Britain. There are complexities in America, I think, following the Civil War, and the kind of provisions that were provided for federal soldiers versus Confederate ones. There's quite a significant disparity there. And so I guess these more sophisticated devices were probably used more frequently in the sort of the north of the country following the Civil War. So yeah, you're right. There absolutely are these complexities that run through my work. Thank you. Great questions, Leonard.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. I can't see who's speaking.
Oh,
actually.
I'm sorry. Okay, I wasn't sure if I was being on speaker yet. Thank you for the great lecture. I'm sorry I had to come in a little bit later, but I was curious. You talk about this idea of passing, and about you touched a bit on the kind of sensory experience of prosthetics. So I was wondering, with this love story with Lady Letitia, did you get into any of the kind of gendered ideas of the kind of sensory experience of what prosthetics ought to feel like for men as opposed to women? I was curious because you talked then about, factory factory workers and such. So there's different applications for these hands at the time, right? Especially when we think about it in the context of love stories. So I was just curious if you came across any of that.
Yeah. I guess I've not come across too much in terms of discourse about how prostheses should feel on any kind of sensuous or romantic level in the period. But I think that there is something interesting going on along gender lines and stereotypes in that story, in terms of the insensate prosthetic that Lady Letitia has, and ideas to do with activity and passivity in terms of sexuality. So Pamela Gilbert's done some really interesting work about how touch is gendered in 19th century culture, and I think that applies actually quite closely to this story, that we have this insensate but perfectly formed, attractive looking prosthetic device used by a female who is desired, but this device is in many ways passive. It can't feel itself, but her suitors are able-bodied and are very keen to touch it and experience it themselves. But in the story, that obviously becomes problematic because of the coldness of the device, that it doesn't feel fleshly, that it feels artificial, which is why Lady Letitia usually wears a glove over the prosthesis in the story, but also why she's resistant to her lover Van Sittart touching the device. So you're definitely right. There's certainly something interesting going on along gender lines, in terms of the way that the device feels to others and how it's unable to feel itself. So really good question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer. I'm curious to look into that a little more. Awesome. Thanks.
I'll jump in here, if that's all right. Ryan, would you consider those stories to be science fiction? And if not, have you run into any, because I can't think of any prosthesis narratives in scientific romance, speculative fiction, early science fiction, because it seems to hit, the themes you're pulling out seem to be so seemingly perfect to that early genre, which is optimistic about the things that science can do, but pessimistic about the impact on humanity. Depends on who. Some people simply like robot stories, and fair enough. But have you seen crossover, or indeed would you consider this kind of a partially science fiction story?
I don't think I would consider these two stories science fiction, really, because I think that they are imagining devices, or at least devices that would have been similar to the ones marketed at the time. I don't think there's anything particularly speculative about them, although I think Lady Letitia's upper hand is kind of pushing the boundaries and transgressive in terms of the marital futurity that it imagines. There are other texts that are certainly more speculative in terms of how they imagine prosthetic devices. There is, really, I guess it depends on how you define science fiction and how far back you want to trace some of its tropes. But certainly from the 1830s, I've found poems and stories, and one that comes to mind is Frances Morley's The Flying Burgomaster, which is an extended poem about a burgomaster who is fitted with an artificial leg that's so sophisticated that it has a mind of its own and a will and agency of its own, and it ultimately sort of runs him into the ground and continues its activity even after he's passed. So there is kind of a dystopic kind of speculative imaginary there from the 1830s onwards. But I guess in terms of the sort of imminent writers that you would associate more with early science fiction, I guess especially H.G. Wells, I was surprised to not find that much with H.G. Wells in terms of representations of prosthetics. In fact, only one example springs to mind, which is in The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth. And it's a marginal character in that story called Mr. Skinner, who's represented as an artificial eye user. But we actually only discover that he's an artificial eye user after he's consumed by a giant rat. The food of the gods enables whatever organism consumes it to grow exponentially. So it's, of course, rats eat the food of the gods, grow exponentially. And so, yeah, so the only remnants left of Mr. Skinner are this artificial eye. And so it stands as I guess quite a kind of an uncomfortable symbol in some ways about what it is and how it might outlast the human being. I guess it kind of stands as a kind of futuristic spectre in a way, or an imaginary of what might be left over if humanity is wiped out. I guess it also speaks to perhaps an understanding of how realistic those devices may have been at that period as well. The fact that it's only revealed that he's an artificial eye user after this remain of him is found. Artificial eyes actually, so by the 1890s, the high-end ones were really quite impressive in terms of their design. Amazing glass blowing techniques used, new types of very light glass, really ornately designed and blown devices. So there's that, but yeah, not too many other H.G. Wells short stories. I think really then my answer would be that there probably quite a lot of the material that I look at you could read as being in part an early form of science fiction, but it's not as though it's a clear sort of body or genre of work that I analyze as a kind of collective case study.
Right. The only one that comes to my mind would be the, I'm going to get the name wrong, but The Men in the Moon, where the businessman and the scientist go to the moon, and the moon people are all surgically altered to fit their assigned role in the great machine, and there's a loss of humanity of the machine. But still then, none of that is, they're hooking up to the machine. No one's actually has a good arm that looks like an arm. That it didn't occur to me till the day that seems weird, unless we consider Frankenstein to be like a prosthetic person. But we're going beyond that's enlarging the scope there. Cool. Thank you. Sorry, it's off of your topic question somewhat, but thank you very much.
No worries, no worries. I mean, certainly when we move into the 20th century, and we think about comics, we think about superheroes, we think about films like Star Wars, Terminator, etc., then the prosthetic and science fiction really become entwined culturally, but I'm just not sure that it's happening quite in the same way in the late 19th century.
And then in steampunk, the modern person writing a Victorian style environment would never be the same. It would never work without someone having a metal hand that looks like it's made out of wonderful Victorian brass. But that's us now. They're not actually doing it at the time, surprisingly. Cool. Professor Marshall has a question.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you very much for your talk. I thought the mix of adverts, statistics, reactions to the adverts, literature, and law was marvelous. And I like your argument that as things became, the discussion on the normal was becoming more solidified, there was always a criticism at the side of it, so that when we do futurity, in a way, you take the seeds of futurity in the past, and that's really nice. I think I missed on one of your argument, or maybe you were too fast or I was too slow, but you said that Dickens used prosthetics in the structure of his novel. Did I understand what you? Maybe I didn't understand what you were saying, but could you say that again and maybe elaborate?
Yeah. I mean, really, that there is that's a quotation from other critics. So I'll happily sort of send you the references if you like. But I think to use an example then would be our mutual friend, with the centrality of Silas Weggs as a villain and prosthesis user, and his representation in that novel very much leads his humanity and his agency with the materiality of his prosthetic limb. So the woodenness of his peg leg starts to kind of take over his character in some ways. And so one strand, I guess, of the plot of that novel is a kind of battle of agency in terms of discovering this will that's needed as a kind of resolution to the plot between a character who is kind of cyborgian, if you like, in some ways, part man, part prosthetic, a wooden man, versus the able-bodied protagonist and his acolytes. So I guess that would be an example from my own work that would sort of show how central the prosthetic is, not necessarily just as kind of plot device, but in terms of character development and in terms of sort of broader themes that drive the plot. That'd be one example from my work that would explain.
Okay, good. It's totally clear to me now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead, sorry.
So I was kind of curious, in your talk, you talk a lot about wholeness and sensation. And I'm kind of curious about to what extent Abel's notions of sensation are being remade here more broadly. Are we witnessing a rupture or discontinuity in how sensation is being read with the able body? I'm also kind of curious a bit as well, maybe about the marketing of these prosthetic limbs and these prostheses. Is there marketing at all for providing sensation? Because we see at one point in your story, one of the stories, that not feeling in some ways is being coded as masculine. And I'm kind of curious about it if feeling is being coded as feminine, right? So are we seeing in some ways that Lady Letitia's smaller hand being, fetishized for its feeling, it's for being sensate?
I actually think it's maybe the reverse that's going on in that story. I think a feeling in a kind of a haptic sense in that story, the power of the feeler is male there. It's actually her suitors. It's actually Carr who's trying to kind of extort and blackmail her, who knows the truth behind this device that looks perfect but doesn't feel it. I think actually that the passivity, if you like, or the insensate nature of the device does tell us something about the limited agency of a woman in her position as an amputee, potentially in that period. But I think that what's powerful about that story is how it tries to imagine something different, how it tries to imagine how resisting passing, how owning difference, how accepting difference can bring about a positive resolution. I might have not answered the first part of your question there. I can't remember all of it, but it sounded very interesting.
Yeah. No, I think that you started to touch on some of the stuff. The thing that I was curious about is basically two different parts, actually, really. One is that can we see like an ableist notion of sensation being remade here more broadly, like historically? Is this a rupture, a moment of discontinuity in the history of sensation and its relationship to disability? And two, is there, I guess, marketing in some ways for prostheses that provide sensation? And is that gendered in any way?
Okay. So the first part of your question, yes, I do remember it correctly as being very interesting, but I think also that is quite a big claim, and I think I need to go away and think about that. But that is a very interesting topic, so I'm going to make a note of that. The second part of your question, to do with the marketing of the devices and sensation. It is a topic that comes up sometimes, and I think again it's a case of the prosthetist trying to sort of balance endorsement with a level of realism. So I haven't come across any cases where a prosthetist promises that their device will enable a user to feel or that it will feel anything like a human limb. But often they will say that if you wear a glove over the device, and I guess this is particularly for female users, that it won't be perceptible as a prosthesis, that it might enable you to pass. But Henry Heather-Bigg, the sort of mid-century British prosthesis, he did acknowledge in his own work that was one of his key problems that he couldn't get past. He couldn't get past this issue of the prosthetic hand just not feeling like an organic hand. So it's an issue that's acknowledged, but I think in the marketing materials, emphasis is placed on an additional level of prosthesis, if you like, with the clothing that should be worn in addition to the device, to make it more concealing. But great question. Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a Professor Daniel Kinsey of Carleton University has a question, but her internet's not really allowing video talk, so I'm going to ask on her behalf. And it relates to thing theory and stories of prosthetic limbs with minds of their own. There are stories about jewels with minds of their own, or at least fears about the agency of some jewels. The Moonstone springs to her mind as the first example. Does this have any purchase in Prince Rupert's Emerald Ring, which she points out she has not read, so enlighten, with the insensate hand vis-a-vis the Emerald Ring?
Yeah, not so much with the emerald, I don't think, in that story, but with the prosthetic, I think that that thing theory would provide an interesting lens to ring that story. So as I understand it, in thing theory, it's often that the thinginess or the materiality or the centrality of the object comes to the fore often when it goes wrong. And that certainly is the case for Prince Rupert's Emerald Ring, because of course it's when General Wilkins, when he's wearing the prosthetic hand and wearing the ring on the prosthetic hand, and he falls over and breaks the hand ruptures, if you like, it no longer becomes functional. That's when, I guess, the crux of the story, the problem of the story arises. And I guess then the sort of the eventual discovery of that would, and the conclusion of the narrative where that device is repaired would, I guess it would fit that kind of thing theory model. So yeah, I guess that would be a useful lens, although less so for the Emerald, more so for the prosthetic device, I think. But good question. Thank you, Danielle.
I wonder if I could risk putting Professor David Bolt on the spot, because Ryan did reference in his talk your work on the tripartite model of disability. Wonder if you I don't know if you how you thought your ideas meshed with his. Oh, sorry, David, you're still muted. That might. Oh no. Sorry about that, David. If the program isn't.
Yeah, I think you can only request.
Yeah, I'm sorry about.
We can't actually do it for David.
Sorry about that, David. Yeah, we're not able to unmute your feed. Sorry about that. That's unfortunately a limitation with Zoom.
Maybe David can answer in writing.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible.
Even if not now, then yeah, if you have any thoughts about the uptake of the tripartite model in the paper, David, yeah, be very happy to talk to you over email or separately. I think I did write to you a while back to let you know that I was employing the model in that paper. So yeah, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on how I deployed it.
Okay, good. So you have each other's contact. Sorry about that. And to those just listening, we got a thumbs up from that. So open floor again. Does anyone else have any other questions? If anyone else would like to maybe ask a question, but wouldn't like to come up on the video, feel free to privately message me in the chat, and I would be happy to read out other questions. In the meantime, I'm going to stick my own in about race. Ryan, you talked about, well, two names that really jumped out for me. I mean, you talked about the towards the end of the century, well, from the 1860s maybe, increasingly concern about the embodiment of morality, and I think implied in that is intelligence. You bring up phrenology, and you reference both Francis Galton and Anthony Trollope, both people who I didn't know any of their so much of their work that would impact on disability, physical disability. But I assign it to my students because of their they both have opinions on race, and as we move into scientific racism, really there's an increasing suggestion among some wings of medical communities that there is an embodiment of intellectual capacity, moral ability, increasing likeliness of crime. Really, what is the major difference between thinking that someone born disabled has something fundamentally limiting about them in the similarity to believing that someone born insert non-Anglo-Saxon race has this or that, or if they're from Cornwall or the poor, even if they are from the Anglo-Saxon race, right? Limits. I guess really my main question is, what have you found, or what do you find interesting about, I guess I'm just saying the two things are similar, but we talked about the gendering. Have you encountered much racialization in these in prosthesis narratives? I don't know how prosthetics would flip it, or just does anything come to mind on that front?
I haven't yet found a lot of racial diversity in the kinds of literary sources that I've been investigating. So that is a bit of a limitation of the work, and as a sort of follow-up project would be something I'd be interested to look at. But yeah, I've not found any really that I can think of that spring to mind, sources of non-white prosthesis users. in the materials that I've looked at. If anyone has any recommendations, I'd be very, very happy to receive them. And yeah, I do think it would make for an interesting follow-up project. Perhaps I'm looking in the wrong places.
Well, maybe I could, as a then different way to ask that question, is there, because we're talking about people getting into scientific racism and effectively protogenetics and real genetics, just poorly applied, have you found is there really a perceived difference between those, like the human bundle, that happened to him, right? So in a world where you're born into a certain amount of your traits or a range of limiting your traits, is there a perceived major difference between those born disabled, even just physically, and those acquiring disability through accident?
Yes, I think there is. And I think that there seems to be more stigma attached to difference that can be read as heritable than that which is acquired. I think, as going back to Leonard's question earlier, that sometimes is honor and valor that's attached to disabled war veterans, and that certainly comes through in certain texts. But yes, I think heritable disability heritable difference is treated with a lot more, in a lot more of a negative way, and often disableist way in sources. So I guess to use Silas Wegg from our mutual friend as an example again, he's always very defensive in that text about how he lost his limb. It's never quite clear exactly how it happened, but he's very quick to argue against any arguments that it stems from heritable deformity. So I think that as a kind of a small anecdotal example, that kind of speaks to the difference there between acquired and inheritable difference.
And as you pointed out, due to what a pregnant woman sees can affect the baby, even acquired disability can be inheritable, which is a wonderful flip of logic that further stigmatizes. Sandy Barron has a question, and so either, I'm not sure if he's typing it out or...
No, I can speak. You can hear me, right?
Hi, Sandy. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ryan, for the great talk. I came in a little bit late, but yeah, which is too bad. I had a question about... Now, I'm probably portraying some things that I don't understand about Victorian literature. It's not really my field, but there's a very sort of individualistic paradigm that I think is probably indicative of literature of that age. Do you see any evidence in the literature that you've looked at into what you could clumsily call, and I'll go for it, so like social prostheses, sort of like fraternal efforts, especially for workers who have been injured on the job, or members of trades unions? Have you seen any examples of sort of disability from a cultural perspective rather than a medical perspective? Do you know what I mean? Or is that just sort of not there at all in the Victorian era?
Yeah, not a whole lot, but it's an interesting concept, and I think in reality there were some railway companies, for instance, that did provide workers with some subsistence if they were injured on the job, for prostheses to be purchased. Unfortunately, yeah, just not really represented in literature. But I think actually a good example that fits what you described as a kind of a social approach to prosthesis is in Moby Dick. If we think about the way that Ahab's ship, the Pequod, is adapted to fit his needs, it's not just that he has the ivory leg. There are various holes in the decking so that he can gain a purchase. There are ropes and balustrades that's specially put on the ship to enable him to traverse it more easily. So I think, and the way that he's supported by his crew, and he's supported with, for this kind of megalomaniacal desire to avenge himself on Moby Dick, the way that he's supported in that endeavor by his crew, I think speaks in a problematic but interesting way to that idea of a prosthesis not necessarily just being a medical device, but could be a communal attitude. Yeah, great question. Thank you, Sandy.
I think I've unmuted if I can come back in.
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear,
Yeah.
David.
Sorry about that. I couldn't remember the keystrokes and I couldn't find the screen. But yeah,
No.
picking up on the sort of suggestion around the tripartite model. I think, Ryan, I remember speaking to you a few years ago about that model. I think I might have talked at something that you were at. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It was one of your events on, I think it was on teaching practice, accessibility at Liverpool Hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was a CCDS thing, but to be fair to my colleague, I didn't organise that one. That was my colleague, Dr. Penketh, who organised it. So,
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
well, yeah, and just by coincidence, I happen to be writing something on the tripartite model right now. So, I came to your talk, and I hadn't really clicked that you would be using that model. So I apologise for that. I think that had slipped my mind, or I didn't know. So it was quite uncanny, really, to come away from it to find it being used in the way that you used it. So I appreciate that. Thank you for that, and I'm glad you found it useful. Engaging with that model and with the concept of disability futurity, I'm just wondering, and perhaps this is a bit predictable, really, but I'm wondering the present situation, if I can turn it like that, has adjusted your reading of these texts, because obviously I realise that you, as we all do here, you will have started work on this before the present situation, as it were, and then here you are now looking at these texts from a different angle, a different understanding of society, of humanity, even dare I say. And I just wondered if that has made you rethink anything you said or brought anything else to the table, because I think the third aspect of the tripartite model does suggest progress, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think with Lady Letitia's Lilliput Hand, in particular, out of the two case studies, I think that that third element of non-normative positivism, I think that does come through strongly in that short story. Yeah. And actually, yeah, maybe should be something that I go back and emphasize a little bit more. Thinking about the present situation, I'm not sure that it's quite kind of sunk in and permeated exactly how what's going on now might shift my thinking with this particular paper. Is there anything that springs to your mind of something that I mentioned that sort of speaks to the current situation that you think?
I suppose really I'm thinking of you as a fellow academic who's doing work at this time, as it were.
Yeah.
I know that it's a little bit different, but I happen to be writing on Samuel Beckett text when this all kicked in, as it were, and I found myself leaving the house in a silent area, and the whole situation was, walking away from the work and then into a scenario outside that seemed rather worse than the bleak situation in the text that I was critiquing.
Yeah.
Now I realise Samuel Beckett is, very different from Dickens and so on, but I can't help but thinking that it does, we got our famous colleague Leonard Davis here, and talking about the end of normal at a certain stage, and now we're in a situation where people are talking about the new normal, and I'm just wondering, where is the sort of new non-normal, as it were? Where does that leave us in the next part of whatever happens next? Maybe I'm sort of adding too much of the present situation in a non-academic way, but I don't really know how we can not do that now, if that makes any sense.
No, I think you're right. I'm just not sure I've got the answer yet. I think it's present in my mind, but I'm not sure I've quite got the solution.
I wonder if we could draw Leonard Davis out on that point, because that would be a really interesting aspect. As the guy who sort of taught us so much about normalcy so long ago.
Yeah, I think Leonard's unfortunately had to leave. Yeah,
he's already writing the next book.
Yeah, well, perhaps, yeah. I can see. Yeah, he dropped a message in the chat a little while back to say that.
Well, thanks anyway, Ryan. That is interesting.
No, I'm sorry that I can't answer your question.
I think that would be.
But it's present in my mind, and I'll certainly think about it more moving forward. Really interesting stuff. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Well, it's been a nice long discussion. Thank you, everybody, for your questions, and Ryan for your for fielding them all and for your talk in the first place. I'd like to thank. I guess I'm just about to repeat what I just said. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank everyone for participating, and I'd like everyone to join me one more time, if visually, thanking Ryan Sweet for his wonderful talk. And sorry, that's going to come up weird on the video, but everyone's hands are up in the air. So, oh, nice. There's a little emoticon there. Excellent.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ryan. You've done a great job sorting this out in difficult circumstances and getting together a really dynamic audience for me to present to. So many thanks everyone for your time, and thanks again to the research group for providing this platform. I think times are really difficult at the moment, but I think one really positive thing that comes out of this is that it pushes many of us to adopt technologies that are more accessible and might enable us to have conversations across the pond a little bit more easily now that we are more experienced doing so. So I hope that we can continue these discussions again soon. So thanks again, Ryan.
It's an excellent place to end. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.